This is the DoughRoller Money Podcast, episode number 191. My name is Rob Berger. I'm the founder of DoughRoller.net and the host of this podcast. Today we're going to talk about banking, specifically online banks versus traditional banks. Is there really much of a difference anymore? And should we prefer one versus the other? We'll talk about the pros and cons. We're also going to answer a great question I received from a listener named Stephanie concerning investing.
Welcome to the DoughRoller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Well, I hope you're having a great day today. I've been looking forward to this podcast for a couple of reasons, but mainly because of the question I received from Stephanie. We've heard from Stephanie. She was on the show, and she and I email back and forth pretty regularly, and she's always sends me interesting articles and questions, and I got a good one from her the other day that I wanted to share with you and then respond to. So here's the email from Stephanie. She said, "Good morning, Rob. My brother forwarded me this article from the Wall Street Journal about the market dips. Overall, I agree with what they wrote, particularly about not being able to weather large changes in the market when you are close to retirement. However, after listening to your podcast for over a year now, this one paragraph bugged me." And here it is. This is a paragraph from the Wall Street Journal article. It's, quote, "A 30-year period in which the stock market drops at the beginning and rises towards the end can have the identical average annual rate of return as a 3-decade period in which stocks rise at the beginning and fall at the end, but the results will be drastically different," end quote. Stephanie continued, "I thought you once actually did the math on this one in a podcast, I can't remember which podcast, and showed that the order of market losses versus gains did not matter. I think I remember you did the example with alternating 10% gains and 10% losses, showing that it didn't matter if the market went up first or down first, and even did the extreme examples of if the market went down for the first half of your investing life versus the last half. I am confused. I guess it would matter more if the amount you were investing changed with time. See, I was investing $10,000 per year when I was 25, let's see here, and increased this yearly by some small amount so that by the time I was 65, I was investing $50,000 per year. In that case, I guess that the timing would matter more. I just really don't like that statement above. What are your thoughts, Stephanie?" Well, that's a great question. And any question that involves math, as long as it's not too complicated, is a question that I love. So the first thing that I did was try to figure out which podcast she was referring to. And I'm pretty sure I know the answer to that. I believe she's referring to podcast number 75. And you can actually check that out at DoughRoller.net/podcast 75. That podcast was about Dave Ramsey's claim that the market has, on average, returned 12% a year since 1926. We sort of took a deep dive on how Dave calculates that number, why his conclusions are different than, well, frankly, every other financial and investing expert I've ever heard, which say the market's basically returned around 10%. And we explained why that is. And in some ways, we explained why both Dave and everyone else are right, but also why the 10% answer is really the better answer. And it was in that podcast, I believe that's the one Stephanie is referring to. I actually spent about 25 minutes listening to part of that podcast today, which was kind of fun, oddly enough. I don't normally listen to my own podcast, but I spent 25 minutes listening to podcast 75 in response to Stephanie's question. And I'm pretty sure that's the one she's referring to. And without going into all the details of that podcast, just to respond to her question, a real quick review. It's easy to take an average of something. We can imagine, students in a classroom, 30 of them, they take a test. It's very easy to take the average. You add up the 30 test scores, you divide it by 30, you get your average. Pretty simple. You can do the same thing with stock market returns, right? We could go back to whatever, let's say 1926, and define the market in some way. The S&P 500 doesn't actually go back that far, but we could, come up with some way to measure the returns each year and just add them all up and divide by, well, I'm not sure what that number would be, somewhere around 90, I guess. And you'd get a simple average of the stock market returns. Well, mutual funds, ETFs, financial professionals, they don't calculate it that way. Why not? Well, because you can't take the result and then apply it each and every year and get the actual results that someone would have obtained if they'd actually been invested during that whole time period. And that may strike some as odd. And if you really want to dive down into those details, I suggest you listen to podcast 75. But effectively, what you need to calculate is the compound annual growth rate. And that's not the same thing as a simple average. At least it's not the same thing if there's any variance in the amount of your returns each year. If you happen to get the exact same return year in and year out over the relevant time period, the simple average and the compound annual growth rate would be the same. For example, if you just earned 10% for 50 years, year in and year out. But of course, that's not reality, certainly not the reality of the stock market. So whenever you're dealing with variable rates of return, you need to calculate the compound annual growth rate, and it's always going to be lower than the simple average. So it was in that podcast where, as Stephanie mentioned, I talked about how the order of your returns doesn't matter. In other words, let's take a simple example. Let's say you have $100,000 and we're going to invest it for just 2 years. And let's assume that in year one, you gain 10%, and in year two, you lose 10%, right? Pretty simple example. Now, if we took the simple average of those returns, it'd be zero, right? 10 in the first year minus 10 the second, add them together, you get 0, divide by 2, it's 0. Yes, you can divide 0 by 2. You can't divide 2 by 0, but you can divide 0 by 2. It's 0. That's the simple average. And if we were going to use that as a way to sort of evaluate what we think we'd end up with, we would say, oh, well, we'll still have our 100,000. We'll use Dave's approach, simple average, comes out to 0. We must still have our 100 grand. Well, unfortunately, that's not how it works. If we actually do the math year by year, the first year we gain 10%, so our 100,000 goes to 110, right? In the second year, and this is the trick, in the second year when we lose 10%, we're not losing 10% of our original $100,000. We're losing 10% of our $110,000. Well, that equals 11 grand. And so we end up not with 100,000 after 2 years, we end up with 99,000, right? Well, now let's reverse it. Rather than earning 10% the first year and losing 10% the second, let's switch it. So we'll lose 10% the first year. That would take our 100 grand down to 90, right? 10% of 100,000 is 10 grand, leaves us with 90 grand. In year two, we gain 10%. Well, 10% of 90 is 9,000. And look at that. We're back to our magical $99,000. It didn't matter whether we gained 10% the first year and lost 10 the second, or lost 10% the first year and gained 10% the second. The result is the same. So given that, how do we make sense of this Wall Street Journal article, which, by the way, is entitled "Buying the Dips Doesn't Work for Everyone," and you can Google that if you want to find the article, where it says, when you're in retirement, when you enter retirement, if the market has a lot of bad years right up front, it can really, decrease the chances that you'll have enough money to sustain you through a 30-year retirement. Why does that seem to be the case? And you've probably heard that before. It's certainly not news. How does that square with this notion that the order of returns doesn't matter? Well, here's the difference. In my hypothetical that I gave just a minute ago, as well as the one in podcast number 75, I wasn't withdrawing money from the account for purposes of retirement. We were just leaving all of the money in there, in the account, and running the hypotheticals. If we now add a wrinkle and say, okay, well, wait a minute, we're going to start pulling money out each year to sort of simulate a retirement, then the sequencing of returns matters very much. That's the difference. Now, I love the math, so I put together a very simple hypothetical that I'm just going to walk through. Let's imagine we've got 100 grand, and we're just going to do it for 2 years. And in year one, we're going to earn 10%, and in year two, we're going to lose 10%. And then we're going to do it again where we flip it, where we lose 10% first, then we gain 10%. Now, in these examples, though, we're also going to withdraw money. We're going to simulate retirement. We'll assume 4%. Now, I'm going to just start with 100 grand balance. So we'll assume that we withdraw 4% in year one, which is 4 grand. And then we're going to adjust that $4,000 by inflation. I've just assumed 3%. And then we're going to see if the sequencing of returns matters. So if we do this, so what we're going to do, we're going to start with 100 grand at day one, and we're going to immediately take out $4,000. So that leaves us with $96,000 on day one. And then for the first year, let's assume we earn 10%. So what's 10% of $96,000? Well, that's $9,600. And if you add that to $96,000, you end up with $105,600 at the end of year one, which for you folks keeping score at home is also the beginning of year two. So we got $105,600. Now we're going to take out not $4,000, but $4,000 plus 3%, $4,120. That drops us immediately to $101,480. Now we're going to lose 10% in year two. So as we go through year two, we lose 10%, and we end year two or start year three with $91,332. Now we're going to, again, make our annual withdrawal for retirement. We're going to increase it by 3%. $42,43.60 would be our total, and that's going to leave us with a grand total of $87,088.40. Now, all you have to remember in this hypothetical, I know I've thrown a lot of numbers out at you, is that we assumed we were going to earn 10% the first year and lose 10% the second. We're taking out $4,000 adjusted for inflation, and the end result at the end of year two, or I guess the beginning of year three, after we've taken our withdrawal, is $87,000. Now, if we run the exact same hypothetical, but instead we assume that we lose the 10% first and then earn the 10% in the second year, our withdrawal numbers are going to be the same because they're based on our initial starting value. Our ending number is actually lower than $87,000. It actually comes out to $86,264.40. So in that example, where we're withdrawing money for retirement, the sequencing of returns absolutely matters. It's a big, big deal. Now, in our case, say, well, it's a difference of maybe $800, but think about it. First of all, it's only over 2 years. We're going to retire. We're planning for a 30-year retirement, and a relatively small amount of money as well. I think most people are going to retire potentially with substantially a lot more money than that. And so if you start out your retirement with 2, 3, 4, 5 years of a really ugly market, it can have a big impact on your ability to survive a 30-year retirement with the money that you have. Now, I think that answers Stephanie's question. I hope it does. She'll absolutely let me know if it doesn't. But I want to take this one step further. Because, you think about this, say, okay, Rob, I get it. The sequencing of returns matter when you're taking money out, right? But what do I do about that? I mean, I can't control the stock market. If I retire, I'm kind of I'm kind of in a bad position if the stock market happens to go down. Well, here's one of the things that I haven't seen addressed. Maybe there's a study out there that addresses it. Most of the studies that I've read on the sequencing of returns issues assumes a certain retirement fund, let's say $1 million. And it kind of just assumes it was one giant fund, and it assumes a certain withdrawal rate, usually typically 4% or maybe a range. And then it just runs a bunch of potential stock market return scenarios, sort of a Monte Carlo kind of analysis, and determines, what your odds are of having your money outlive you or you outliving your money, and particularly when you've got a bunch of bad years at the start of retirement. What I haven't seen, though, is what I think would be a more useful analysis. And maybe some of you have seen this, and if you have, I'd love to hear about it. Shoot me an email, dr@DoughRoller.net. But it's this: when I retire, and I'm still a number of years away, I plan to use the bucket approach to retirement. And what that means is I'll probably put about 5 years as my best guess now. Maybe that'll change when I get to that point in my life. But 5 years of spending money in cash or other short-term investments. Online, we're going to talk about online banks. Well, some of it will probably be in online high-yield savings accounts or short to intermediate term CDs, short-term bonds, perhaps, maybe a little in intermediate bonds. But the point is, I'm going to have probably at least 5 years of spending in accounts that won't be subject to the volatility of the stock market. So the portion of my portfolio that is in the stock market, if the market happens to go down the first, say, 3 years, for example, of my retirement, that'll be okay. I won't start pulling money out of those investments to refuel the cash side of my savings. I'll just let the 5 years slowly dwindle down to 4, to 3, to 2, I suppose in theory, if we had a really ugly market and it was 5 bad years and it kept going, at some point I might have to tap some of my stock investments. But the goal would be to set up these buckets, if you will, so that I can out survive a bad market. And when the market's doing very well, like it had been at least up until recently, I might pull more out and have more than 5 years of cash on hand. On a good market where I think it's overvalued to some degree, I might have 6 or 7 or 10 years of cash, depending on just how overvalued I think the market is, so that I have even more cushion to survive a prolonged bear market. And I don't see a lot of studies analyzing this issue that way. So if you know of one, let me know, because that would be great. I'd love to read it and I'd love to share it with everyone else, and I'll keep my eyes open for it as well. But that's how I kind of, at this point, again, I'm a number of years away from that, but that's kind of how I see dealing with this issue of you retire and then the market just tanks and you have 3, 4, 5 bad years and it really hurts your investments. And if you think back to 2008, the market lost 50%. But if you had 5 years of cash saved up, and we fast forward from 2008 to say 2013, during which time you didn't have to sell stocks, you could have lived off the cash and short-term savings, you'd have been fine. I mean, your stock investments would have gone back up. 2013 alone was 32%, as I believe. And so that's kind of how I envision doing it. And so anyway, that's my approach to dealing with the volatility in retirement, or at least how I think I'll approach it when I get there. But again, if you're aware of studies that look at that particular issue, would love to hear from you. Shoot me an email, dr@DoughRoller.net. And Stephanie, thanks for the great question. If anyone else has questions or topics you want me to cover, love to hear from you. You can shoot me an email at dr@DoughRoller.net, or you can leave a voicemail, DoughRoller.net/voicemail, and would love to hear from you. If you leave a voicemail, I'll play it on the air, and that's all kinds of fun. So there you go. Okay. On to the main topic, although maybe that was the main topic. I don't know. But the main topic, if you will, today it's banking, and it's online banking versus traditional banking. And this sort of came up for me as I was working with my kids on their banking needs. Our daughter's at college, and so how do we deal with money? And does she carry a credit card or not? If she has a bank account, what does that look like? And, it got into this whole business of online banking versus traditional banking. So back in the day, before banks were online, a number of banks came out that were, at the time, were viewed as online banks. Back then, the big banks, the traditional brick and mortar banks, didn't have much of an online presence. It's kind of hard to imagine. It's so commonplace today, but I remember the days when Citibank was not online. And you had companies like ING Direct. You remember those guys, the orange account? And these were banks that were 100% online. You could not go into a branch. They didn't have any branches. You banked online on the internet. You could call them, but that was it. You couldn't go into a branch. And that's what I perceive or understand to be an online bank. And they provided a number of disadvantages, actually, and a number of advantages. And they've kind of persisted through today, because what happened, obviously, the brick and mortar banks realized reasonably quickly that the internet was here to stay and they needed to have an online presence. And so, if you fast forward to today, pretty much regardless of where you bank, you're going to have some amount of ability to transact banking business online. Now, I have seen some smaller banks, including credit unions, where their online banking, frankly, isn't as robust as some of the larger banks. But I don't know of any bank that, at least that I've ever dealt with, that doesn't have a pretty significant online presence and the ability to transact a lot of your typical banking business online. And so in some ways, it almost seems as if this concept of an online bank versus, I guess, other banks with branches seems to be not so much significant. They're all online, right? Well, it turns out there really is some significant differences and some pros and cons of both. And so I want to run through those very quickly and then kind of explain at least how we do it for what it's worth. And hopefully it'll be of help to some of you. So the advantages of an online bank are a few. One is almost without exception, the interest rates on savings accounts and certificates of deposit are better. They're higher than a traditional bank. And I track these accounts, these online banks. I usually update the post every month with what are the highest interest rates available for checking accounts, savings accounts, and certificates of deposit. And pretty much without fail, the online banks win. And today, for example, the online banks for a savings account are paying anywhere from about 75 basis points at the low end to, I think, about 105 basis points, 1.05% on the high end. And these are banks like Capital One 360, which, by the way, it used to be ING Direct. They bought that bank and renamed it Capital One 360. American Express, believe it or not, has an online bank. Synchrony Bank, Ally Bank, those are just to name a few. They tend to have much higher interest rates on savings accounts and certificates of deposit and even checking accounts than your traditional bank. A traditional bank like Citibank, where I've banked for a couple of decades now, their interest rate on savings accounts is like 1 basis point. I mean, it's really, really low. That's from the advantages of an online bank. That is, without question, the biggest advantage. Their interest rates are just much, much higher. The other advantage I've seen is that by and large, their fees are lower. Now, it's not to say they don't have fees, and you have to look at the terms and conditions of each account. In many cases, for example, the checking account, they may waive fees if you keep a certain average balance in the account, monthly average balance, or if you have a certain number of transactions with your debit card that they will give you. But by and large, what I've seen is that their fees are lower than traditional banks. And that raises the question, all right, got it. Interest rates are generally higher, fees are generally lower. How could there be any disadvantages? Well, the big disadvantage is that there are no branches. If you want to go in and talk to someone face to face, you can't. Now, whether that's a significant disadvantage for you is going to vary. Some people, one question to ask if you have a traditional bank is, when was the last time you went into a branch? I mean, you may not remember the last time you went into a branch. I rarely go into Citibank and talk to a teller, but there are times when I need to. And when I need to, I got to tell you, it's a good feeling to know I can go in and talk to the teller or the branch manager. And it usually occurs when some kind of significant issue has arisen that I need resolved, and I'd much rather resolve it in person. So that's the biggest disadvantage in my experience between an online bank on the one hand and traditional banks, which obviously have branches. Now, a number of relatively new developments, have made the lack of a branch for an online bank at least a little more palatable. And the biggest one for me is the ability to deposit a check with your mobile phone. That is something that I've seen developed, and I think most banks now have it over the last year or two. I use that feature with Citibank, oddly enough, a brick and mortar bank, but I also use it with Capital One 360, where I have one of two online banks. I also have an account at Ally, and I'll explain all that in a minute. But the ability to deposit checks with a mobile phone has really eliminated in many instances my need to go inside a bank, or even for that matter to find an ATM machine to try to deposit the checks. I can simply do it from home with my mobile phone, and it's something I've taught my children. My daughter works when she's not in school, works at a job that doesn't offer direct deposit, if you can imagine that. And so they give her a physical check, and so she deposits the check on her own with her mobile phone into her account at Capital One 360. She puts half in her savings. Very proud of her. She's saving 50% of every dollar she makes, and then leaves the rest to spend in her money account, which is effectively kind of like an online checking account that Capital One 360 offers. So the ability to do mobile, or check deposits through your mobile phone, I think, has been a pretty significant advancement and eliminated at least one of the issues that I had with online banking. So then the question is, well, do you need one or the other? Do you have both? And I kind of like the advantages of both. So here's my setup. I've had my checking account at Citibank for a couple of decades now. Obviously, they have branches everywhere. The other thing I like about Citibank is that they have ATMs inside 7-Elevens. So it's easy to find an ATM where I'm not going to be charged a fee if I need to withdraw money. And of course, I've got the branches where I can go in and talk to the branch manager or the teller. And again, I don't do that a lot, but boy, when I do it, I really need it. And it's just been convenient. So I've continued to use Citibank for my checking account. I do have a savings account there. I don't normally keep much in it, or if I do, it's usually for a very short period of time. For example, just leading up to the time when I'll pay estimated income tax, which of course is coming up here in a few days. But by and large, I use Citibank for my personal and business checking accounts. I also use their Citi Double Cash credit card because I think it's one of the best cashback cards available. But I want to take the advantage of the higher interest rates for the online banks. And so I have two online bank accounts, as I mentioned, Capital One 360 and Ally. There's some history there. I have Capital One 360 because back in the day I had ING Direct, and it just converted over to Capital One 360 account. As online banks go, they don't actually offer the highest interest rates, and I'm going to look up their current interest rate. I mean, it's still good, and it's still much better than a traditional bank, but you probably can do a little better. I believe there's 75 basis points currently, and I'm going to double check that. But I keep a good chunk of my savings in Capital One 360. But the other thing I use it for is, as I mentioned, our children. Yeah, it is 75 basis points. Our children have a money account there. It's basically I kind of think of it as an online checking account with a debit card. As I mentioned, my daughter can make mobile deposits with her mobile phone with a check, and can use the debit card, just about anywhere. And it's a good tool to manage their money. There are no fees associated with the account, and both my son and daughter have used it, and I just find it as very convenient. If I need to transfer money to their account, I can just log in. I can do it with my phone. I can do it, with my laptop. It's very easy to do. And then the other account I have is Ally Bank. Its interest rate's a little higher, 99 basis points, which is why I have it. And that's where I actually have the majority of our savings account. Again, it's not a huge difference, about 24 basis points, but hey, I might as well pocket the 24 basis points. Why should I let someone else pocket it? So I have the majority of our savings in Ally Bank. Now, it's not the actual highest. I'm looking now, again, Synchrony Bank does very well at 1.05%. So you could even do a little bit better than Ally at the moment. But that's where I happen to bank. And it's very convenient. I can transfer money from Citibank, which is where I get my direct deposit for my job and for the business, and can easily move it over to either Capital One or Ally Bank. I've linked Capital One to my PayPal account, so I can, if I sell something on eBay, I just sold a watch, I can transfer the proceeds from that sale right to Capital One 360. That's been very convenient. And if I ever want to get the money back, I can transfer it right back to Citibank, and then online pay bills with it, withdraw it, whatever I want to do. So that's been my approach. I kind of have both, and it's very easy to manage. It may sound like it's a little bit much. I could probably get rid of one of the online banks, but particularly with the kids on Capital One 360, I don't see a reason to change that right now. They're all very easy to manage inside of YNAB. Well, you need a budget, which is the budgeting tool that I use. It's very easy to connect all of those to Personal Capital, which I do, so I can track them on Personal Capital's financial dashboard. So it's all, again, very, very easy to do. So that's my approach to, banking and online banking versus traditional banking. I'll have some more details in terms of convenience, factors, security, and other things in the show notes to this podcast. So you want to check those out to get that information. You'll find that at DoughRoller.net/podcast 191. DoughRoller.net/podcast 191. Well, that wraps up today's show. Remember, you can support the show if you'd like. DoughRoller.net/support. Many thanks for those who are already supporting the show. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, topics you want me to cover, whatever, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email, dr@DoughRoller.net. Hey, hope you have a great day. And remember, until next time, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.